So before we get into the detail, the modelling matters. We've been told it will be released eventually. Does that mean before the election?
Well, the Prime Minister's outlined that it'll be released before the next budget now, and he knows when, of course, the election is. But, the modelling just backs up the plan. We have a 130-page plan which actually takes Australians step by step through how...
I want to go through all of that.
Sure,
but before the election campaign, it would be important to have that, because otherwise it gets lost in the maelstrom.
Well, I don't think we want anything to be lost in the maelstrom. One of the things we've done is been very transparent with our plan about not just setting a target, not just the time frame that we're going to meet that target of net zero by 2050, but critically that then we've gone through with a detailed plan about how we're going to go through each step, the viability of technologies to achieve it, the timeframes, the cost schedules of getting there. And that's why we've taken this approach. And I mean, frankly, we look at other political parties like Labor Party, they have a target. No plan. They don't even have a 2030 target. And of course,
we'll see what's to come on theirs. We'll see what's to come on theirs.
Tom.
Well, of course it does, but they needed to see what would happen at Glasgow and so on. We'll talk about their plan. I'm sure we will. Sure. Let's talk about you. Big assumptions on technology, in particular on CCS, so carbon capture and storage, and green hydrogen. If they're not as effective as we hope, if they don't take the leaps that we hope, will you spend more money or not get to net zero?
What we're banking on is these technologies to deliver consistent with what other countries are doing. These aren't things that we've just kind of plucked out of the air. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its scenarios has included realistic assumptions about these technologies coming online, but then to be cost competitive. The International Energy Agency in its pathway to net zero has done exactly the same thing. So we're very optimistic about where they can go.
And if they don't, though? What if they don't?
Well, that's a projection. We know one of the things that's been...
But I guess the point is there a plan B? If it doesn't deliver what you hope it does, do you spend more money to make sure we get to net zero, or do we fall short of net zero?
Well, what we're focused on, Tom, is a portfolio response that manages risk. We look at what's happening in Europe right now, where energy prices are going through the roof because they bet on just a small number of technologies as part of their solution. And so, of course, some technologies might move faster. Some might move a bit slower. Some are going to come online faster than we expect. And otherwise, and that's why we're taking a risk management approach and a portfolio approach. So the role of those different technologies could change, and the degree that they use could change based on their speed. What we're optimistic, though, about is that they're going to come online, that we're going to be able to adopt them on a cost-competitive basis. And frankly, that's what other countries are going to need to do to cut their greenhouse gas emissions so they can follow our lead and be part of a solution.
One of the confident reasons for the government saying we'll get there was renewable energy. We've been a world leader in renewable energy. That's because we've had big subsidies for rooftop solar in this country, and we've mandated targets for providers. These types of approaches, though, are being ruled out in the next part.
Well, that was...
plan. Why?
Go back to the original renewable energy target, and that was actually introduced by the Howard government. And the reason they stated...
Abbott government tried to rein it right back.
Well, and let me answer the question politely, Tom, which is introduced originally because it was how do we get this industry going and make it viable and competitive. Now, what Labor did was say we're going to bet all money on black. They took the non-risk management approach and put everything on black. Well, what we saw was a huge boost of renewable energy, but we're going to take a risk-based approach.
But hang on, you said huge boost to renewable energy. You're boasting about that huge boost and saying it was a bad bet that Labor made.
No, I said they put everything on black. We're taking a risk management approach. And one of the key pillars of what we announced yesterday was a plan for ultra-low-cost solar because it no longer needs a subsidy. Even the Labor Party acknowledges that. When Anthony Albanese has been asked on programs like 7:30 on the ABC, he said these no longer require carbon taxes to support them.
Not these and not carbon taxes, but it's about what other incentives you need to put into the system to make sure they're used.
That's why we have things like the Climate Solutions Fund, the Emissions Reduction Fund, which are very much
Let me talk about that. So the Emissions Reduction Fund, within that is the safeguard mechanism. This is what sets the limit for hundreds of our biggest emitters, how much they can emit, often each year, sometimes it's multi-years. But let's say how much they can emit each year. That's the only thing to stop them undermining the rest of our reduction. So if these big emitters don't actually bring down their emissions under the safeguard mechanism, will you look at tightening it?
Well, what the safeguard mechanism does is creates a direct incentive for them to use technology to actually achieve their targets.
Except it's too high right now.
Well, I don't think it is too high right now, because a lot of the focus of people claiming it's too high is because they want to broaden it out to include many other businesses, often that are very difficult to offset their emissions. And we'll start to include things like farmers, where, yes, we have technological approaches around soil carbon and how we can use the enrichment of our soils to sequester carbon and get better outcomes for our farmers, but we're not going to do it where it acts as a tax, an economy-wide tax.
But it's set so high right now that if we're talking about net zero, if it's kept at that level, it's way too high for us to achieve net zero for all these big emitters. That's true, isn't it? It has to come down eventually.
Well, it is if you only look at it through the only policy, but that's not the only policy. As I said, we're taking a portfolio approach, and that's why we have the first economy-wide plan to get Australia to net zero by 2050 that was released yesterday.
But you can have all these parts of the economy reducing emissions, and the big emitters, if they've got this very high cap still, if they don't opt to bring their emissions down because it won't be compulsory, then overall our emissions just don't come down enough.
But they'll have the incentive driven by changing market demand. You know, there is a demand in the global economy for lower emissions output, and products and services. But in addition to that, under the safeguard mechanism, they do have incentives to invest in technology. And these companies are already stating quite openly, as you've raised with me previously, that they've set their own targets, their own ambitions about how to reduce their emissions. So the difference between Labor's plan, which is very much focused on taxes, is ours is how do we create the incentives, get business, industry, households, government all working together.
So this will just be markets and companies doing the right thing. What if they don't? If we have big emitters not bringing down emissions and that's undermining the overall reduction in emissions, will you look at the safeguard mechanism?
Well, what we're looking at is how we can utilise technology to make sure that it does work. And Tom,
that's fine, but what I'm saying is if this safeguard mechanism, because it's set so high, means some companies, let's say you've got an industrial company and it doesn't want to pay for CCS, it doesn't want to pay for permits, offset permits, and its emissions are staying very high, and it means we're not hitting targets. Would you then look at the safeguard mechanism and tightening it?
Well, I know, the Labor Party and others want an economy-wide carbon tax. That is not our approach.
Well, there's definitely a tax and a price on something. It's not just the Labor Party, it's a lot of economists.
We know that there are a lot of economists who like things in theory but not in practice, and they've long advocated for things like carbon tax and emissions trading schemes because the bigger the artifice, the more they can control it.
So is that a no to ever tighten this?
Our approach has been, at every point, how do we use technology?
You brought in the safeguard mechanism. I'm just asking how you use it.
Well, exactly as it's being used now. But one of the
there's a review on it, so I'm just asking, would it ever be tightened?
Well, I don't want to prejudge any review, but the critical thing is we've always said we want to use technology to be the solution. You just look at the reductions in the cost of solar.
There's technology, but there's also making sure companies adopt it. This industrial company could use CCS, but if there's no incentive to, then it might not. That's the point. It's whether you make a company take up or try to encourage them to take up.
But we already know there are incentives for companies to take up these pathways. They reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, yes, but they also reduce their electricity consumption. One of the reasons we've been...
You don't do that through CCS. That's what I'm talking about. Why? It's not just electricity consumption. When there's an industrial company that can't reduce it, but they have to sort of add something on like CCS, that costs money. It costs them.
Well, everything can involve costing money if you're going to make investments for the future. I mean, companies do that all the time if they want to.
But this is an investment to only reduce emissions. That's the only point.
But if you only look at it through the prism of just reducing emissions, you're missing a bigger story. One of the reasons we've been able to increase our projections on our 2030 targets has been because of energy efficiency, which has meant that households and businesses have consumed less energy and become more efficient. When I went and studied carbon accounting many years ago, the thing that became really obvious to me was you can have all these taxes if you want, but actually there are plenty of ways when companies audit their own business practices, they reduce their emissions footprint, they reduce their costs directly as a consequence of becoming more efficient. And we want efficient, competitive companies.
With that big leap forward in CCS, do you think it's fair to say thermal coal will cease to be used around the world?
I'm not going to make a projection about what's happening in other countries, Tom. What I do think
is that thermal coal's only future is with a much better CCS.
Well, what we've said is we want to offset any emissions directly associated with, the extraction of coal. We want to make sure that we're part of the solution. And what other countries invest in terms of their energy generation is ultimately up to them. And it's not like we're the only ones who have these mineral deposits in the world. We know that China has its own coal, so they can stop buying from us. They just buy nastier, dirtier coal domestically. And this has always been one of the great challenges, is the substitution is real.
Tim Wilson, congratulations on the new portfolio, by the way. I'm sure we'll talk about it again soon.
Thanks, Tom. Go D's.